So there are two terms we would want to contrast: reparation ecologies and ecological reparation, where in the latter one, ecological becomes the adjective and it falls into an old trope of the imperialist and civilizing project, which is that we're going to separate nature and society. And then later, much later, especially after 1970, we have mainstream environmentalists trying to put them together. And from there, we have all manner of academics and sometimes environmental justice activists trying to reshape that in turn into a more relational and holistic optic. When Raj and I talk about something called reparation ecology, we are essentially outlining the utopian moment. That is, where do we want to arrive at? And a little bit of how do we get there? And what we stress in that conclusion are crucial ideological moments of remembering, because so much of capitalist history and bourgeois ideology in particular is premised on a flight from history and a denial of history, one that's taken up even by much of the left under banners like fossil capital, by the way. And so we call for remembering, we call for overcoming the not just the amnesia, but the anesthesia of bourgeois ideology and its totalizing but never total impacts on our thought. So we are insisting not just on a recuperation of the actual existing histories of capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and life. That's one moment of it, but also really recuperating a vision and visions drawing on manifold traditions, not just indigenous, but those are some Soviet communists after 1917, many other visions of reparative and holistic vision. Now, when I said that one part of it is a utopian moment, the other part, which we didn't really touch on because one can only do so much, I think, but I would insist also on something called Reconstruction ecology, which tackles both the problem of national liberation and socialist reconstruction in the short 20th century, but also gestures towards Black Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction, so called after the Civil War in the United States, where the radical Republicans, yes, that's actually what they were called, the radical Republicans in Congress saw that the old slave owning aristocracy had reasserted their political power in the American South, the former states of the Confederacy, and they sent in the military to reorganize a democratic society. And for a short time, there was indeed a democratic society in which African Americans were elected to state legislatures, to Congress, to all manner of elected office. There was a transformation of the class politics of that region under military dictatorship, essentially. And that's a recurring problem in the history of Reconstruction ecologies, of Reconstruction programs across the past century or so, is how to defend the gains of a social revolution, or what the historian W.E.B. Du Bois called the general strike of proletarian slaves in the Civil War. How are those gains defended? Because if the gains cannot be defended, there can be no repairing the ecology. One of the realizations that has come to me as I've been unpacking, excavating the long, very long history of climate changes and civilizational change across the Holocene, but especially since the Bronze Age crisis in the 12th century BCE, is that moments of unfavorable climate change in the Northern Hemisphere are moments of political crisis and therefore moments of political possibility. One of my favorite examples, and this is why I hate the term socialism or barbarism or various versions of that, is that the collapse of the Roman West in the fourth and fifth centuries syncs up almost directly first with the most severe drought in Eurasia over the past 2,000 years, pushing the so called barbarian peoples westward, but also is followed by the Dark Ages cold period. In this moment, where the Western Roman mode of production falls into irreparable crisis, peasantries reassert themselves, they occupy the villas, they repurpose them, and they reinvent village life, which had been largely destroyed under Western Roman hegemony. It looks different in the East, and we can talk about that. But the point, nevertheless, is significant that even in a period of unfavorable climate change, very cold, wet, punctuated by the volcanism of the 1530s, and the so-called worst year in human history. That's debatable. We have the success of a peasant mode of production in reconstructing the conditions for quality of life. There are fewer. They adjust the fertility regime. Classes are largely abolished. There are hierarchies, but classes are abolished. The standard of living for everyone is higher based on height and archaeological evidence. That means that the dark ages for ruling classes are often golden ages for the producing classes or for the reproducing classes. And that's a moment we need to keep in mind against the catastrophism of both centrist and so-called radical environmentalism today, which is very much stuck in the 17th century with a Hobbesian vision after the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the midst of what? Of the very worst and most severe moments of the Little Ice Age. And it's driven by what? Well, natural forcing, volcanism, shifts in the North Atlantic Oscillation, but also by the genocides, the slaving induced genocides of the New World that induced what the geographers Maslin and Lewis call the Orbis spike, Orbis after the Latin for globe, in which the destruction of indigenous peoples in the Americas leads to forests grow back, soils are left undisturbed, they absorb the carbon, and it brings down carbon dioxide concentrations, reinforcing natural forcing and leading to this moment of the 17th century, the long, cold 17th century, as I've been calling it, which is a moment of political crisis. And it also feeds the fundamental structures of modern thought, of Cartesian dualism after Descartes, of Lockean dualism, of civilized and savages living in a state of so-called nature. Later in the century, pardon me, and then a apocalyptic vision of Thomas Hobbes and the imperative of the bourgeois state to create the conditions of social order in an era of climate crisis. He doesn't say climate crisis because he's not aware of it at that moment, but nevertheless, it's very, very clear that this moment was this moment of roughly 1550 to 1700 was one of not just a dramatically unfavorable climate shift in the Northern Hemisphere, but also a moment of political crisis. And also from Beijing to Paris, by the way, not limited to the European world by any stretch of the imagination. And it was a moment in which we have the first great wave of the maturing of a communist imaginary with levelers and diggers. This is the problem of Cromwell's army in the late 1640s, which is sitting outside of London, full of a bunch of communists who want to abolish class society. So we want to keep this moment of the utopian vision linked to a practical program of a Reconstruction ecology, which I would suggest is, in the final analysis, a socialist vision in the web of life.
I think sometimes in your work you say, for example, capitalism has externalized carbon emissions. So you there is a metonymy here, and instead of capitalism, probably we should say capital. But I want to say, if we move there and we talk about the working classes as the agents of history, and so then we leave behind an aspect which you have introduced with the word ecology dimension, and we move more in an understanding which is dominated by the social. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that the proletariat always exists in and through the relations of class power of the imperial bourgeoisie and the world that it seeks to create. That is a world that is ideologically, biologically, socially, etc., a world that favors the endless accumulation of capital. And so, no, I don't think I'm leaving behind. I want to also make a little footnote here that I think is important. World systems is generally not well understood because of the dynamics of the world knowledge factory in the way that middle class professors essentially like to appropriate Wallerstein, which is a world of so-called core and periphery and structure and yada yada yada. We know all of that. Uh, it's widely not understood because people don't really read Wallerstein, and when they do so in a very superficial way. That for Wallerstein, core and periphery were abbreviations for, and this is a direct quote from him, for the worldwide flows of surplus value. That is, and again, another quote, the economic moment, if you will, of the worldwide class struggle. Of course, Wallerstein was his era's greatest, North America's greatest Marxist political sociologist of African decolonization. So understood the questions of race, class, and nation, to borrow a title from a later book, as fundamental to the socialist project. So no, I don't see. I think a lot of. So on the one hand, I think there's some truth, Dimitris, to what you say. If we take the lowest common denominator, sort of global sociology version of world systems, and leave behind everything that Wallerstein was trying to do, which is what most world systems analysts do, and quite different if we understand that capitalism always worked in and through, with and within webs of life in a dynamic environment, making history, which is what Wallerstein does, even if he forgot it at a certain point. No one's perfect, indeed. Now the other part of this is the social is already with and within the web of life. So that's my point of the planetary proletariat. That it is to say that not just in terms of the politico-economic relations of capital, but also in terms of subjectivity. Here, I think of somebody like Jason Hreibel, are animals part of the working class? Now, animals are not a separate subject, and this is a danger that runs throughout critical environmental thinking because they want to move away from the working class as the agent of socialism. And indeed, the professional managerial class, in for decades, and in environmental studies in particular, has fantasized an international dictatorship of experts. This is the techno scientific fantasy of mainstream environmentalism, from the limits to growth to the Anthropocene, to the Davos World Economic Forum vision of a great reset. Yes, run by billionaires, but enthusiastically chatted up by people like Johann Rockström, one of the world's greatest climate scientists, progenitor of the planetary boundaries framework, who says things like our economic system no longer works, but we're not actually going to touch the question of the accumulation of capital or capitalism. Now, finally, Dimitris, you have these rich, multi-layered questions. No, for me, and when I was writing Web of Life, I foregrounded class very clearly, and um, I went back after everyone said I didn't deal with class. It turns out I deal with class about 200 times in a book that runs about 300 pages. So I'll leave the listeners to make up their minds about that. You are part of the effort was to weave together a class politics and a class struggle history with an account of capital empire science in the web of life over long historical time. And so there are elements of resolution that got lost. But I would also say, frankly, under the conditions of censorship in the knowledge factory, there were limits to how far I could push the explicit class analysis. And we all need to be frank and open about the profound ideological censorship of the knowledge factory, in especially in foreclosing our capacity to talk in a sophisticated way about class politics. That's huge. So in subsequent work, I've insisted that, for instance, the popular Anthropocene is a bourgeois grift. That is a con job. It's an ideological con job that is rooted in the deep history of imperialism and the civilizing project, which is, as I've pointed out, especially against what I see as essentially neoliberalism for polite company, the work of Walter Mignolo and company, who want to dissolve and erase the question of class from that of empire. And the result is that we have an ultimately very, very narrow and reductionist view of settler colonialism that forgets, well, what does it forget? It forgets that imperialism and colonialism are how the imperial bourgeoisies prefer to wage the class struggle. That's how they prefer to conduct primitive accumulation. That's how they prefer to carry out the civilizing project, so that they can secure and appropriate the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies in class terms. Unless we can develop a historically grounded sense of class politics that is internationalist and biospheric, then we are going to be defeated. And I think that's one of the great lessons of the short 20th century, of all manner of internationalisms, but especially of socialist and communist and national liberation internationalism.